There's some amount of controversy about both of these books in reference to authorship, because some people say, well, the content of Ephesians in particular, the content of Ephesians indicates that it was not written by Paul, but it was written on up into the 2nd century. Well, that's been pretty well proven to be false, but that nevertheless was something that people held to a good bit. When I was doing my graduate work, I had to write a graduate paper on the book of Ephesians. And I picked up a book called The Key to Ephesians, and I thought, oh boy, that's going to give me a lot of good information. The whole book, it was a short book, only 100, 150 pages, but the whole book was devoted to the idea that Paul could not have written this. And so that didn't do me very much good. Well, let's look though at the book of Colossians, written by Paul somewhere in the neighborhood of 61, 62 AD, something like that. We don't know exactly when he was released from prison or exactly how long before his release that he actually did this writing. The style of the book is quite different than many of the other writings of Paul. Paul has some favorite words that we find particularly in Philippians and Romans and Galatians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But in the book of Colossians, he doesn't use those favorite words. One of those words, of course, was righteousness, another justification, the flesh and the spirit and these things. These were favorite words with Paul that he used very frequently. Those words don't occur in the same type of context in Colossians as they occur in Galatians, Philippians, Romans, and Corinthians. An interesting thing that in the Greek manuscripts that doesn't really come through to us so much in the English. Almost the entire first chapter of Ephesians, it's all one sentence. That doesn't come through to us in exactly the same way in English translation, but these long sentences, the same in Colossians as in Ephesians. And so this seems to show some kinship in authorship here. The problems that were present there in Colossae were very, very important. But an interesting thing about it was that the problems that occurred in Colossae, that city to which Colossians was written, we don't find those problems elsewhere. And Paul mentions a number of different problems that seem to have gone together to present an entirely different picture in Colossians than we find anywhere else in the entire New Testament. Let me just mention some things about this. Gnosticism was a big problem in the later part of the 1st century. Well, Paul seems to indicate that there were some Gnostic beliefs in the church at Colossae, but he doesn't develop this just a whole lot. Then there was the worship of angels that Paul mentioned in Colossians, but we don't find this in the 1st century church, and we don't find it really in the early 2nd century church. So we don't know exactly why this was such a problem there. And then asceticism, living a hermit life or a detached life. This was a problem at Colossae. And Paul attacks that problem and talks about the futility of asceticism, or the futility of living a detached life. The idea was if I go and live in a cave somewhere and I'm not exposed to the sins of the world, I can live a more sinless life. And so particularly in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, this became a very important thing for some of them to do. They became hermits. And then there's also the idea of Judaistic teaching. Now this we are familiar with. In Romans and Galatians in particular, Paul talks about the fallacy of mixing Judaism with Christianity. And so he talks a little bit about that. also in the book of Colossians here. But it seems that he talks about these things all put together, and so apparently the heresy there in the city of Colossae was quite different than the heresy that we find in other churches in the first century. Let me talk just a little bit about this whole idea of Gnosticism. It may be familiar to some of you, and some people might say, well, this is sort of philosophical thing. I don't understand how it relates to us. We'll get to that. I want to be sure that we show how this thing would be related. Gnosticism was, in fact, a heathen philosophy. And it crept into the church, and the church in the latter part of the first century and the early part of the second century, churches were almost destroyed by Gnosticism. Well, what were the Gnostics? What did the Gnostics believe? Well, one of the first things that they believed that worked its way into Christianity was that everything material is evil. I am material, you are material, and so we are evil. Well, you might say, yes, that's pretty well true, isn't it? Well, just because it's material doesn't mean that it's evil. But then they came to the problem of, what about Jesus Christ? Was he evil? And they came up with an idea that Jesus did not have a real physical body, that he was not flesh and blood. He appeared that way, but they described it like this in the second century. If he walked along a beach, he would leave no footprints because he really was not a material person. Stop and think of what that does to our whole concept of the nature of Christ. Well, he was made in all points, the writer of Hebrews says. He was made in all points like we are. Excuse me. I'm sorry. He was made in all points like we are, and yet without sin. Then he says also in Hebrews that he was tempted in all points like we are, and yet without sin. Well, if he didn't have a material body, if he didn't have a physical body, he was just a spirit that appeared like a man, then you see, he couldn't have been tempted like I'm tempted. And so when this came into Christianity, it made some real important inroads, and it really destroyed the whole idea of redemption, because he didn't really die on the cross at all. He was not buried, and he did not rise on the third day at all, because he was a spirit. Well, who died on the cross? Well, there are all kinds of theories about that. Jesus was not born of the Virgin Mary. She simply gave birth to his spirit. Well, you see, that gets down to the very essence of what we believe about Christ. Well, this also gives us something else. Did God, who is good, create human beings who are evil? Now, this has nothing to do with the sin of the Garden of Eden, but this is part of what Paul was writing to oppose in the book of Colossians. And so the Gnostics developed a very interesting philosophy here. They said that the good God created what they called an emanation, which is ultimately translated in the New Testament in Colossians and also in Ephesians as the word fullness. And each of these emanations was a little bit farther removed from God, and this emanation would create another. It was a little bit farther removed than the other, and then he would create another and another and another, and each one progressively was just a little bit evil. This is what Paul is talking about in the book of Colossians when he talks about the fullness. And then finally, and all of this was their theory, but this is what Paul was writing against. Finally, there was an emanation, a fullness that was evil enough that he could create the world. And so the world was not created by the God that we know. It was created by a lesser being who could create something evil. And he created the world, which is material, and he put mankind in the world, who are also flesh and blood. And so the whole thing is evil, you see. So when Jesus came into the world, he couldn't join with this evil world, and so Jesus really was a phantom. He was a spirit only. Now, many people don't realize that this is what Paul was up against in this book of Colossians. And the whole idea of God and what God was about in reference to the creation is a very important thing for Paul to be speaking of in this book of Colossians here. And so, what about God being a good God? Well, the Gnostics had to divide things up here. The God of the Old Testament was a God of war. He was a God of anger. He was a God of retaliation. He was a God of punishment. And he was an evil God. And the God of the New Testament is different from that. And so we actually have a polytheistic thing here that says something about paganism being brought into the city of Colossae here. And so these things combined ended up creating a terrible situation in the city of Colossae. This led to all kinds of speculations. It led to all kinds of misinformation. And sometimes when we read the book of Colossians, we think, what in the world was Paul talking about here? The worship of angels, for example, and these types of things. Well, this is the type of thing that he was talking about. And this is what he was wrestling with. So the book of Colossians is a rather complex book if we ignore the background of it. If we look at the background closely, of course, we can see these things that are really taking place here. Now, there's another thing that Paul talks about in the book of Colossians, and that is this thing of asceticism. And so he's going to talk about how the Gnostics and the pagans and even a few among the Jews believe that the holiest life is to be separated from the unholy people of this world. And so the holier lifestyle was the lifestyle of a hermit, or the lifestyle of a person who is living separate from anyone else. Well, of course, in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, this really caught on. In the medieval church, it was a very important, a very big thing. And so Paul is showing in Colossians that all of these things, he says, that they have an appearance of humility and wisdom. And then he talks about will worship, self-imposed worship, worship that I believe makes me a more humble person. And so Paul says, all of this has the appearance of humility and these things, but he says they are of no use when it comes to the indulgence of the flesh. When a person begins talking about the resisting of temptation, when a person starts talking about the importance of devotion to God, he says these things have a show of wisdom, but they don't really accomplish what God designed that the Christian life should be like. Well, now, how does Paul overcome this? Basically, Paul overcomes it in a relatively simple way. He says, I want to show you what Christ is like. And so the book of Colossians develops the grandeur of Christ as the head of the church. And so he makes some very interesting remarks about Christ. For example, in the 1st chapter, in the 13th verse, he says that he is the one who has rescued us from the dominion of darkness. Well, you see, if Jesus was not a human being, a flesh and blood being. He didn't die on the cross. He could not have rescued us because there would have been no such thing really as atonement. But he says he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. And then he also uses this expression in the 14th verse of that first chapter. He says, it is in Christ that we have redemption, the forgiveness of our sins. Well, from a Gnostic point of view, that would have been an impossibility. That just never could be. Why? Because they did not believe that Jesus was a flesh and blood human being. And then here is an interesting one in the next verse, the 15th verse of chapter 1, where he says that he is the firstborn of all creation and that he is the image of God. Now, there's an interesting idea here that I think we need to mention. Number one, it says that he was born, or he was referred to as the firstborn of all creation. This has caused some people to believe that Jesus didn't exist before the time that he was born into this world. That isn't what the writer has in mind at all. He is talking about the fact that Jesus, the firstborn of God, God gave his only begotten Son. That is the idea. And it really is the only Son like this one. Only begotten really carries the idea of there is none other just like this one. He is the only one of this kind. And so he is in the image of God. Now, Jesus said, I and the Father are one. If you have known me, you've known the Father. Then the writer of Hebrews says that he partook of flesh and blood, just like we partake of flesh and blood. And so this is a very strongly Christological idea, of course, and Paul is developing his arguments to say, I want you to see who Christ really was. And if you understand this and accept this, it discounts all of these heresies of Gnosticism and the worship of angels and of these emanations and the fullnesses and so forth. Then in the 16th and 17th verse of the first chapter, he says, by him and for him, all things were created. Now that's an interesting statement. There are 3 times, I believe it is, where Christ is referred to as creator. One of these is right here, and one of them is, or 2 of them are in the book of Hebrews. God, having of old time spoken to the fathers through the prophets in divers portions and in divers manners, has at the end of these days spoken unto us through his Son. And then he talks about how he appointed him heir of all things, through whom he created the worlds. And so the whole idea is that Christ is exalted here in the book of Colossians to show us something of his power, of his rulership, of who he really is. He is before all things, he says, Paul says in Colossians, and he is the head of the body, the church. Then he goes on and says, God is pleased to have in him all the fullness dwells bodily. Now, what does this do to this heresy there in the city of Colossae that we're talking about? Well, instead of having emanation, each one a little inferior to the other, as we mentioned just a moment ago, and finally the one who is evil enough to create the world and all, when you see Christ as the totality of this fullness, then Christ becomes the only link. Not a whole lot of links. Christ, in him all of the fullness dwells bodily, he says. And so Christ is all, and he is in all. Through him, he goes on and says in the 20th verse, through him he reconciles all things to himself, whether on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through the blood which was shed on the cross. Wait a minute. If Jesus was just a phantom, If Jesus was just spirit, there was no blood shed on the cross. And so Paul is showing that if you see Christ as God presents Christ, that it does away with all of these things, the errors of Gnosticism. It does away with all of this speculation. It does away with all of this philosophy of in reference to the nature of Christ and all, because Christ is all and he is in all. So this shows us that redemption is through Christ. That's the way that you and I come to God. It's through Jesus Christ. And so at this point, we need to see something of a practical nature. I mentioned this morning. I need to mention it again. In the religious world, or let me say this, in our world generally, religion has this undesirable characteristic. And that is that people decide what I want to believe, what I do believe, how it ought to be. And then they go to the text and try to find support for what they believe. Now, you and I, unfortunately, we're not immune to this. You and I do this too. We simply have to guard against it all the time. Now, there's the word exegesis that you've heard me use a number of times. The word is from two Greek words, ek, which means out of, to move away from or out of, and kaleo, gnosko, which means knowledge, to get the knowledge out, you see. And so that's the idea of just honest Bible study, is to get the knowledge out. Now, here's the thing. Exegesis, getting the knowledge out, exegesis must precede and determine one's theology or one's faith. Now, let me say that again. Unless we go to the text for the purpose of getting out of the text what the text has to offer, we will never come up with the right faith, the right theology, the right beliefs. So we set our beliefs aside, we go to the text, and we exegete it. We take out of it its truth. Then, on the basis of that, we develop our faith, our theology, what we believe about God, what we believe about Christ, not from philosophy, not from science, not from anything except from the Word of God. Now, once I have done that, I am in a better position now to make application. So, theology has to be the basis of my application. And this is really the message that Paul is giving to the Colossians. Colossians, before you start speculating about these eons and the emanations and the fullnesses and all that, instead of speculation about those things, go to the text. Draw out of the text the knowledge that's there. Then when you form your theology will be text-bound. Then when you form your application, they will be text-bound as well, because your applications are being based on your exegesis, you see. That is really what Paul is trying to do here with these Colossian people. How is he doing it? He is saying, I want you to know about Christ. I want you to know his essence. I want you to know that he was a real human being. I want you to know that in him all of the fullness dwells bodily. I want you to know that he died on a cross, shed his blood just because he was a human being, and that's the atonement. And so this is really the message that Paul has in mind in the book of Colossians. So Paul's letter to the Colossians shows us the importance of understanding the background of each of the books that he gives to us. the culture, the religious beliefs, the philosophies of the day, and circumstances and things like this. When we understand that more clearly, we can have a clearer understanding of the text itself. So, what is the value then of the book of Colossians? Well, it's a very valuable book for us. It's one of the most highly endowed books with the nature of Christ and Christology of any of the books that Paul wrote. Now, when we dig into it then, what should we try to get out of it? I've tried to lay the foundation here, but here I think is what we really need to get out of it. And that is that it's the grandeur of Christ. Christ was not just some sort of a spiritual being that came into the world. The grandeur of Christ. And if we just get that into our heads, it demands our allegiance. It demands our obedience. It demands our love and our devotion to Him. Why? Because He is the head of the church. If tonight you are in any way subject to the gospel invitation, we're going to sing a song that Joe has announced for us, and that will be our invitation song, and we invite you to respond. Let's stand together to sing, please.